Today's speaker is Emeritus Professor Stefan Petrow, who taught history at the University of Tasmania until his retirement in June 2020. He has published 5 books and has others on the go. He's had a long-standing focus on the history of health, urban and town planning in Hobart and Launceston. And today he'll take us back to the 19th century to tell us about shock infectious diseases, in particular typhoid and cholera, and the efforts taken to clean up the environment to prevent outbreaks occurring. So I asked Stefan to come forward and present his talk.
Thanks very much, Marion, and thanks everyone for coming. I should say a couple of things before I start. I've had a cold post-COVID. Some of you, I'm sure, have had colds post-COVID, and it affected my voice, so if it's not as mellifluous as it should be, that's the reason. Second thing is, what I'm talking about today is based on a book that Paul Richards is putting together, where he's looking at asking different people to write about different infectious diseases. And I think it'll be a really interesting book. I don't think anyone's done anything quite like that anywhere else in Australia, certainly not Tasmania. So keep a lookout for that. I hoped Paul would be here so I could give you an update on when it's going to be out, but anyway. So let me start. Over the last 2 years, we've been exposed to disruption, disease and death from COVID-19 or the coronavirus, and have been lucky so far that medical science has been able to respond to the threat quickly and provide some degree of protection from its worst impacts. That is not to deny that many people have died and many more have suffered varying degrees of sickness from the coronavirus, an unknown number suffering long-term consequences from their experience. We are fortunate that most Australians, but certainly not all, have access to a reasonably high standard of medical care and enjoy a reasonably high standard of living. We are certainly a lot luckier because we don't live in the 19th century, when many of those pluses did not apply to a much higher percentage of people, when infectious diseases of different kinds were a constant threatening presence in everyone's lives. Medical science only really gained an understanding of the causes of many infectious diseases and of the ways to deal with them towards the end of the 19th century and to deal with them effectively later. But sorry to say, those in power and the people themselves did not always listen to what doctors and public health officials had to say, or had other ideas about how to protect themselves, or did not want government imposing choices on them, even when it was in their best interests. Now, some of these themes will come up today as I give you an overview of the impact of typhoid and cholera on 19th century Tasmania, with ample illustration about the impact on Launceston. So let me start off with typhoid. Typhoid, along with cholera and smallpox, was one of the shock, as they were called at the time, shock infectious diseases of the 19th century world, and caused much death and sickness in Tasmania too. According to Rebecca Kippin's calculations, from 1839 to 1899, 1,928 deaths were caused by typhoid in Tasmanian registration districts. In the period from 1839 to 1879, 838 of those deaths occurred, but in the much shorter period from 1880 to 1899, the number of deaths was about 1,090. Active steps were taken as a response by colonial and local governments to remove the outbreaks of the cause of the outbreaks of typhoid. So typhoid was caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi, and those who contracted it suffered from abrupt and prolonged diarrhoea, or sometimes constipation, abdominal pain, fever as high as 40 degrees Celsius, blinding headaches, coughs and severe exhaustion. The appearance of faint patches of rosy red colour on the abdomen made diagnosis more obvious. High temperatures could last for weeks, and fatal complications included pneumonia, intestinal perforation, gastrointestinal hemorrhage, and coma. According to Dr. John Simeon Colebrook-Elkington, Chief Officer of the Tasmanian Department of Health, formed in 1903, typhoid could be conveyed by water, milk, sewer emanations, and generally in sanitary conditions, direct infection, as in the case of nurses, dust and flies, infected bedding and clothing and ice cream, shellfish, fried fish, and watercress. As typhoid was a disease of the fecal-oral route, individuals could protect themselves by scrupulous cleanliness. Seemingly healthy people could be carriers of typhoid, as in the famous case of Typhoid Mary in early 20th century New York showed, and could remain undetected until stool samples were examined. She was a cook in New York, so she was in a perfect position to spread typhoid. One reason why typhoid's impact was so great was its ability to kill people apparently in the prime of their lives. For example, in Tasmania, Launceston General Hospital nurses died from typhoid in the 1880s, and well-to-do Chief Justice William Lambert Dobson was a victim of typhoid in March 1898. Even world champion sculler Henry Ernest Searle of Grafton, aged 33, in the peak of his physical condition, died from typhoid in December 1889. Neither grandeur of abode nor perfect apparent health conferred immunity. All are in the power of an invisible, intangible enemy, wrote nurse Frances Gillam Holden in March 1886. No region of Tasmania was immune from typhoid either. From 1888 to 1923, serious outbreaks occurred, sometimes repeatedly, in Beaconsfield, Devonport, Glenorchy, Latrobe, Laprena, Longford, New Norfolk, Queenstown, Ringarooma, Scottsdale, St Helens, the Upper Piper, Westbury and Zeehan. Most typhoid, however, occurred in the two main cities of Hobart and Launceston, and cases from country areas could be treated in the major hospitals located in those two centres, therefore increasing the danger, and I'll come back to that in a little while. Typhoid was mainly related to poor sanitary conditions prevalent throughout Tasmania for much of the 19th century. Public health reformers argued that typhoid was preventable if sanitary measures were implemented, and they urged municipal councils to spend more effort in cleaning up the environment by removing wastes such as rubbish and night soil, inspecting insanitary housing and dairies, and encouraging general cleanliness to reduce the chances of the disease poisons arising, developing and spreading. As typhoid epidemics became more common from the 1880s, municipal councils were forced, however reluctantly, to give more regular attention to such matters, and it's the regularity that's important. The increase in typhoid patients in particular placed pressure on limited accommodation in hospitals, as poor Tasmanians could not afford private treatment in their homes, and skilled nursing was regarded as essential for a speedy recovery. Although cases of typhoid made periodic appearance before the 1850s, let's pick up the story first from about 1874, when concern increased in Launceston. But first I want to say something briefly about councils, Launceston Municipal Council and health. So after responsible government was granted in 1856, municipal government became firmly established and assumed statutory responsibility for sanitary measures. The Launceston Corporation Act 1858 established the Launceston Municipal Council and defined its powers. Another relevant act was the Launceston Improvement Act 1858 that empowered the council to pave, cleanse and drain Launceston, and to appoint a city surveyor and an officer of health. Although an officer of health was not immediately appointed, in the second half of the 19th century, Launceston was ahead of Hobart in sanitary matters. A new waterworks was built in the 1850s, and piped water was slowly extended to most residents. In 1860, the sewering of the town began and was gradually extended. But as the population of Launceston grew, as it approached 10,000, sanitation assumed more importance, and in December 1868, a health committee of 3 aldermen was formed. And thereafter, the incidence of typhoid increased, concern in the community. So, yes, minister sort of thing. In 1874, concerned citizens and doctors urged aldermen to consider the urgency of properly draining or otherwise cleaning the town. The Cornwall Chronicle supported this move, claiming that once Launceston, this is a quote, as healthy a town as could be named on the face of the globe, with a climate equal to Madeira or the choicest spots in Italy for salubrity. So aren't you lucky to live in Launceston? But now, back in 1874, they lived with stagnant pools, rotting garbage, typhoid fever breeding open drains, cut up, worn out streets. Unless municipal action was taken, Launceston would be depopulated, with residents fleeing to healthier localities or dying of infectious diseases. And in March 1875, the Reverend J. Anderson Fawns made a really interesting use of words, declaring that undertakers had never been so busy in Launceston and doctors had more cases than they could handle. He hoped, this is the quote from him, these are the words I think are most interesting. He hoped that the argument supplied by death might activate aldermen. Do you think it did? No? No? Okay, no, you're right. The Launceston Council did nothing immediately to extend sanitary arrangements, and so there was growing agitation. Launceston Examiner, and then around 1882, I think it was, the Daily Telegraph newspapers, they kept pushing for the introduction of sanitary reform. And again, Launceston Examiner co-owner Henry Button had a really interesting analysis of why nothing happened. He gave some sound reasons why no reform was attempted. And he explained that epidemic diseases generated alarm and sweeping alterations and improvements were projected, but before they were begun, the malady subsides, and with it the alarm that awakened it. Button argued that panic was not favourable for starting a great sanitary reformation demanding deliberate consideration of details and untiring resolution in carrying them out. And when I read that, I thought, yes, it applies to disease, but it also applies to climate change. Now, all was not well with the running of the LGH either, and matters came to a head, I think, where am I with these? Came to a head in about 1880. The increase in the population of Launceston and surrounding districts, the closure of the Campbelltown Hospital and the upsurge in typhoid quickly filled up beds in the LGH, and fresh cases had to be refused entry. The hospital board was concerned about patients with typhoid, diphtheria and consumption all being huddled together, TB, huddled together in the same ward. Typhoid and diphtheria cases in country districts were brought to the LGH with insufficient precautions, and while awaiting treatment, spread disease in the houses they stayed in. And there are other issues with disinfecting the sheets of patients and so on. It became a real issue. In early 1883, we start to see, with the increased incidence of typhoid, aldermen did become troubled, and they charged the Sewerage Committee with reporting on the health of Launceston and whether a health officer should be appointed to deal with infectious diseases. And the report of the Sewerage Committee was completed in October 1883. 7 doctors and John George Bushman, a veterinary surgeon with experience in sanitation, was sent 18 questions. 9 questions focused on the spread of typhoid, and the other 9 were related to issues such as housing of workers, the need for a health officer, and the condition of lodging houses, which were quite numerous in the town. Heads of the Launceston Corporation departments and the city missionary also gave evidence. The Sewerage Committee concluded that all the Australian colonies, which is true, were experiencing a wave of typhoid, and that initially the germs of the disease were introduced to Launceston, but stressed that, quoting them, their subsequent continuance, multiplication and spread are unhesitatingly ascribed to imperfect drainage and disregard of the laws of health. Accumulations of ordinary house rubbish and filth of various kinds appear to be common, while stagnant pools are of frequent occurrence. So by removing filth, disease might be greatly diminished, if not completely eradicated. And the report recommended the immediate suppression of cesspits, which are widely used. Now, cesspits took different forms. They could just be a hole in the ground, and families living around that hole in the ground would use it. It could be slightly better built like this one. But the problem was, however it was built, they were rarely emptied in Launceston. And although the evidence weighed against the use of dry earth closets, the committee thought they might be confined to low-lying areas where drainage was difficult. A system of refuse removal was essential, not happening at the time. Witnesses unanimously agreed that the swamp area to the north of Launceston, originally Crown land, was the source of much typhoid and diphtheria. And this area had been subdivided again and again for the building of cheap cottages for labouring men, resulting in an area quite unfit for human dwellings being crowded with them. So the committee recommended approaching the government to stop any further alienation of that land, because it would aggravate what was already, they call it, an evil. The Sewerage Committee decided against appointing a health officer on financial grounds, but supported the appointment of a sanitary officer at a salary of £250 per annum. Bushman, who had served with the army in India until his retirement in late 1879 and who had arrived in Launceston in early 1883, was appointed in November. Sort of, few ties to the community, could be more independent. Tireless and committed, by April 1884, Bushman had inspected 600 premises, noting accumulations of sewage and refuse, and issued 71 notices to clean it up. Well, the Sewerage Committee supported Bushman's proposal for the removal of night soil and refuse by municipal workmen, and recommended that the cost of emptying a cesspool be 20 shillings and the removal of rubbish be 3 pence per load. Now, this is not compulsory, this is by choice. Sewerage Committee further recommended that cesspits be prohibited and replaced by water closets, but where land was less than 1 foot above high water mark, the pail system would be allowed. Pails would be provided by the council and emptied at least twice weekly by the municipal scavenging staff. So by adopting this report, Alderman vindicated Bushman, because there were real questions about Bushman's expertise. But Alderman Bernard Patrick Farrelly said he'd read some of the very highest authorities on sanitary reform and was convinced that Bushman was ridding Launceston of the sources of typhoid, making no distinction of persons, no difference between rich and poor. So from the 1st of July 1885, the use of cesspits was prohibited, and only pails and water closets approved by the corporation could be used. By December 1885, 980 cesspits had been emptied. Remember this is going to be a quiz afterwards on this. 980 cesspits had been emptied, 2,543 tonnes of excreta, just what you wanted to know, collected, and 1,275 premises cleaned. So municipal sanitary administration had improved by 1885, but typhoid cases continued to put pressure on the LGH. Due to hard times, many typhoid patients could not afford private medical attention, and they had to seek treatment in the hospital. But the hospital was not necessarily safer, it still hadn't become safer than their own homes necessarily. Defective hospital drainage spread typhoid to some nurses who could not continue their duties, and nurse Charlotte Pittman died from the disease in April 1885. The Launceston Examiner called the LGH, quote, really a nursery of disease instead of a curative asylum, where the angel of death was present and consigned nurses to a probable martyrdom as certain as that which awaited St. Teresa. Understatement, of course, as usual from the Examiner. But Pittman was not the last nurse to die from typhoid in the Launceston General Hospital. Oh, look at this. Speaking of angels of mercy, thank you very much. Thank goodness for that. So, 1885, with sanitary administration, we see lots of progress. But 1885 is really only the beginning, because in 1885, our first Public Health Act, a specific Public Health Act, was passed with pressure from long-time Launceston Alderman A.D. Douglas, who was Premier. Douglas wanted sanitary provisions to be enforced throughout the colony because many of the infectious diseases originated in rural districts where primitive sanitary arrangements needed tackling and threatened advances achieved in Hobart and Launceston. So the Act established a Central Board of Health, so independent of the local areas, to supervise everything connected with public health and to conduct special inquiries where necessary. Municipal councils and town boards became local boards of health. If a local board failed to enforce the provisions of the Act, the Central Board could order it to do so within a specified period. The Act empowered local boards to control the spread of infectious diseases by, for example, isolating houses and to rid the environment of disease-causing impurities. In 1886, new bylaws were drawn up to regulate the removal of house refuse, drainage and plumbing, water and earth closets, the storage of offensive matter, dairies and cow keepers, bakehouses, butchers and fishmongers. So it's a more holistic approach to health. So since his appointment, Bushman had been pushing for a system of regular refuse removal, which he argued was the foundation of all sanitary science. So in April 1888, when typhoid again was very prevalent, this is a really bad period in the late 1880s, Alderman decided to remove refuse from every house as a regular municipal service. By taking 2p from the general rate and adding it to a new sanitary rate, the new service did not increase rates and mollified ratepayer opposition. By 1895, 60 tonnes of refuse was collected weekly, and most residents enjoyed the benefits of regular removal. Refuse was deposited at the Invermay Park tip. So while that was going on, there was also a debate going on about should we continue with water closets and should we continue to extend the sewerage system? Now, sanitarians said they are major defences against diseases like typhoid, but there was a backlash in Launceston, and debate really heated up over whether the corporation, the council, should persevere with expensive water closets or rely on the cheaper Rochdale removable pail system. To the 23rd of March 1887, over 70 cases of typhoid had been treated at the LGH and another 30 by private doctors. And a number of doctors, William George Maddox, Charles James Pike, Lamington Gray Thompson, James McInerney Pardee, Herbert Charworth Hallows and William Robert Stewart, claimed that the increasing use of water closets, the great defence, their increasing use, that polluted the river, and the sewer gas emanating from sewer lines had corresponded with an increasing incidence of typhoid, diphtheria and other allied fevers and disorders. Mayor Robert Carter thought the doctor's claims were illogical. Sewage had been discharged into the Tamar for some 27 years, while the number of pails had only recently been increased to over 600, which indicated that this change was the cause of increased disease. So Carter also argued that the corporation had spent far too much on the sewerage system to abandon it and spend more on a new system. The majority of the aldermen found the economic argument as compelling as the health one and voted to continue with water closets. And in fact, the Public Health Amendment Act of 1887 empowered the corporation to enforce their use. Thereafter, the corporation was irrevocably committed to extending the sewerage system and quickly improving and repairing it, as was definitely necessary. Ventilators and gas destructors were later installed. Traps were placed on water closets, as Bushmen had advocated, to minimise sewer gas. Launceston Council borrowed more money to spend on the sewerage system. Bushman used his strengthened powers under the Public Health Act to remove cesspits and water wash pits. By 1895, that key year, cesspits and water wash pits were virtually non-existent, and 3,180 water closets were in use. 540 pails were collected by municipal workers, and 74 pails were dealt with privately. So under Bushman's, and Bushman is one of the great heroes of 19th century Launceston. Under Bushman's unremitting zeal and determination judged the Central Board of Health, the sanitary work of the Launceston Municipal Council was quite unique, both in Tasmania and the Australian colonies, so far as preventable diseases are concerned. But Bushman had many enemies. And those enemies disliked his methods and demeanour. He walked around with a cane, as one criticism. And I think he needed it for some of those incorrigible ratepayers. And so his enemies made a concerted effort to dismiss him and succeeded in May 1896 under the guise of saving money. And thereafter, a little while after, the council appointed a health officer. But Bushman had been badly wronged and lost his job for being successful in reducing the incidence of typhoid fever, which had been prevalent and deadly in the late 1880s and early 1890s. But its decline can be clearly seen. So I've got some more statistics. You don't have to remember these ones. From 1888 to 1895, 919, this is in Launceston and surrounding suburbs, 919 cases of typhoid were notified in Launceston, or an annual average of 114.9. From 1896 to 1901, only 247 cases and an annual average of 41.2. I won't go into the death one, but the deaths from typhoid went down like that as well, right into the 1920s. Slowly but surely, deaths decreased. So just to tie up the discussion of typhoid before I move on to cholera, changes in the morbidity and mortality of a disease are the product of a complex set of factors, including improvements in nutrition, the availability of hospital provision and medical treatment, access to district nursing, modifications in the strength of bacteria and viruses, demographic changes, the spread of personal cleanliness, such as washing hands, and the general improvement in the standard of living. No doubt some, perhaps all of these factors played a part in the decline of typhoid in Launceston, but the sources available to us do not allow us to be precise enough about how they did so. What we can say is that there was a concerted effort, belatedly, by the Municipal Council to implement a range of preventive sanitary measures, and those sanitary measures contributed to the lowered incidence and death from typhoid in Launceston by 1900. What about cholera? I won't be able to say as much about cholera for reasons that will become clear. Without doubt, though, the grim King Cholera, as it was called, was the most feared disease of the 19th century around the world, but its impact on Tasmania and its hospitals was minor. Based on her analysis of Tasmania's death registration data for the period 1838 to 1899, which placed cholera under the category of diarrhoea and dysentery diseases, Rebecca Kippen identified deaths in a whole range of categories, which is a problem in itself. This is not her categories, what she took from the statistics created at the time. So this is what she found: 66 deaths from cholera, 66 deaths from English cholera, 45 deaths from cholera infantum, 31 deaths from infantile cholera, 10 deaths from choleric diarrhoea, 4 deaths from cholera morbus, and 2 deaths from European cholera, a total of 224 deaths. There's a problem in diagnosis, clearly. The one that everyone feared was Asiatic cholera. 1 death recorded in the official statistics. But those 225 deaths were a far cry from the 1,928 deaths for typhoid that I mentioned earlier. And they were a far cry from the 3,606 deaths from diarrhoea and the 1,717 deaths from dysentery, those gut diseases closely related to cholera. So as the differences between diarrhoea, dysentery and cholera were so difficult to diagnose, it is possible that the deaths attributed to cholera in Tasmania should really have been attributed to either diarrhoea or dysentery. So what is cholera? Cholera is an acute bacterial infection of the intestine and was caused by ingesting contaminated food and drinking water containing Vibrio cholerae, or by person-to-person contact through the fecal-oral route. Vibrio cholerae bacterium can multiply outside the human body, spreading quickly where living conditions were crowded, as in that court I showed you in the earlier image, where water sources were unprotected and where faeces were not disposed of. Cholera patients exhibited acute watery diarrhoea manifesting as rice water stools, severe cramping and vomiting, resulting in acute dehydration or water loss, speaking of which. Sunken features, and I could not get an image to show this, or not a good image. Sunken features and black-blue skin. So this is a female colonist from India. If untreated, an agonising death could occur within hours, as the rapid loss of fluid constituted the functional equivalent of hemorrhaging to death through hypovolemic shock. And like typhoid, cholera had a predilection for attacking adults in the prime of life. And, people panicked. Here's something from England, not locally, where they were, looking for cures, looking for treatment. So due to the confused conceptions of the pathology and nomenclature of the disease, J.H.L. Cumston, the first Director General of the Australian Department of Public Health, argues that it was probable that no cause of genuine cholera occurred in Australia, and certainly never in epidemic form. Cumston suggests that no true case of Asiatic cholera appears to have occurred in Tasmania to 1923, but cases of acute evacuations with cramps and collapse were diagnosed as Asiatic cholera by medical practitioners. So while Australia was free of the disease, cholera was certainly very widespread in other parts of the globe. And in fact, we can identify 6 pandemics of cholera. 1817-23, Asia. 1830s, 1846-62, 1865-75, Asia, Europe and North America. And 1881-96 and 1899-1923, Asia and Europe. Well, despite its minor impact in Tasmania, throughout the 19th century, if you go to Trove and look at the digitised newspapers for Tasmania, you'll see regular reports, constant reports of a sense of panic with the devastation caused by cholera in these different parts of the world. And foreshadowing similar devastation should cholera become entrenched in Tasmania. So as more people moved around the globe with the development of steamships, cholera moved with them in the guts of crew members and passengers, on their bed linens, clothing and personal effects, and in their waste. From 1851 to 1874, international sanitary conferences held by European countries, really quarantine conferences, focused entirely on cholera's threat. Other diseases such as yellow fever and bubonic plague were considered at subsequent conferences, but cholera remained the most threatening disease, not least because by 1900 there was no consensus on how it spread, or more importantly, to reconcile local outbreaks in different places and individual cases with the more global epidemiological pattern. This is just one example here. So, epidemic cholera, not introduced into Australia, but doctors often diagnosed its presence, or the presence of what they thought was cholera, in different parts of Tasmania, and deaths from cholera were recorded intermittently, as from Rebecca Kippin's work from the 1820s. While the improvements in sanitation in Launceston noted earlier acted as a protection against cholera, preventing the introduction of cholera, especially Asiatic cholera, depended on an efficient and vigilant quarantine system. So I'm going to focus on quarantine, but bearing in mind sanitary change is very important. So as an island colony, Van Diemen's Land was obliged to take precautions against the introduction of infectious diseases on ships from other ports. There were administrative regulations introduced by Governor Arthur, but the first act responding directly to the spread of cholera came with Lieutenant Governor John Franklin. So the Quarantine Act of 1838, which was designed to prevent the introduction, quote, of a disease commonly called malignant cholera or other dangerous and infectious diseases. If any ship left a place where such diseases were present or visited on the way to Van Diemen's Land any such places, they would be subject to quarantine for a specified period in the Derwent or the Tamar. If any member of a ship's crew or passengers left the vessel before the prescribed time for quarantine, they would be fined £300, a lot of money in those days, and face 6 months imprisonment. All goods liable to quarantine could be opened and inspected. Well, back in the convict period, the British government had control of what acts we passed. They didn't like this act. Taking into account the advice of the Superintendent of General Quarantine and the Lords of the Privy Council, Franklin's Act was disallowed by the British government, which decided that a regular system of quarantine was inapplicable to the circumstances of Van Diemen's Land. Quarantine should only be instituted under special orders when any unforeseen emergency arose and disease was confirmed on a visiting vessel. Not that they stopped at a place where there was that disease, but confirmed on the vessel. A Short Quarantine Act 1840 embodied this suggestion and was amended in 1841 to expand on the liabilities of officers in charge of vessels and penalties for breaking the law. So basically, there's a big debate across the 19th century whether vessels should be quarantined and under what circumstances. And of course, the British free trade governments wanted no interference with trade, and nor did the businesses that sent goods here. Now, but was it inapplicable to an island colony? I don't think so. I think it's very applicable to an island colony. And those who doubted that cholera would visit Tasmania had to rethink when the Lady Montagu, carrying coolies from Canton, arrived in Hobart Town in April 1850. Described as a slave ship or a pestilent ship, some 193 coolies had died on the 2-month voyage, and 6 more died during the 17 days quarantine in Hobart Town. One of those who died was thrown overboard, but apparently did not spread the disease on land. The deaths were attributed to dysentery at the time, not cholera. Remember that, hard to tell difference. But a more recent medico, John Goldschmidt, holds that the high death rate and the clinical description of the epidemic was very much in keeping with an outbreak of cholera. So the need to stop cholera from invading was widely supported. Yes, business interests objected to quarantining ships unnecessarily, but all agreed that any ship coming from ports where plague, cholera or yellow fever were raging should be placed under quarantine restrictions. Now, things started to change in 1881 when the worst outbreak of smallpox occurred in Sydney, and the various colonies adopted what they call a Uniform Quarantine Act. So Tasmanians were reasonably confident that an effective system of quarantine would prevent cholera from infiltrating the island. Doubts were raised that Tasmania's system was fit for purpose. So there was another conference in Sydney, another sanitary conference in 1884, said we all must adopt the most strict quarantine laws. Now remember, this is not federation, this is individual colonies in charge of their own actions. But Tasmania did act. So in July 1884, the Tasmanian government announced that Middle Island in the River Tamar would be used as a quarantine site for Launceston. That's down up near Beauty Point, around that area, on the other side, and planned a quarantine station in the south at Barnes Bay, Bruny Island, where suitable buildings were finally built in 1886, and that was a place where returning First World War soldiers went as well. So, favouring strict quarantine, the Tasmanian newspaper based in Launceston argued that Launceston had the greatest need for efficient inspection and proper precautions against the introduction of infectious diseases because it was the main highway of communication between Tasmania and intercolonial and foreign ports. And it quoted the statistic that about 3/4 of Tasmania's seaborne passengers passed through Launceston. In October 1885, the government acted for the first time after this new act was passed and proclaimed that Timor, China, Japan and, roughly speaking, Indonesia, Malaysia, currently today, were infected with Asiatic cholera, and any vessels from those places were liable to quarantine. Well, you have to wait until someone breaches quarantine to see whether your system works. Of course, in 1887, Launceston got its first smallpox outbreak, and the whole debate about whether quarantine was working effectively came to the fore. And there was one dissenting opinion said quarantine, as Tasmania had been doing it, was not worth doing. And this was Alfred Malt, engineering inspector to the Central Board of Health, a very, very competent person. He argued that the system of quarantine adopted in 1884 of detaining ships from 10 to 21 days was useless in preventing the spread of disease. Malt advocated the English system of admitting ships from infected ports if inspection shows no actual case of disease, or where such occurred during the voyage, as soon as a ship, passengers and goods were all disinfected. Now, the English system still required ships to provide information about disease outbreaks, to maintain, high standards of cleanliness on the ship, strict medical and sanitary supervision, vaccination where it was available, and every practicable form of sanitary precaution. The Launceston Examiner counter-argued against Malt that the quarantine regulations checked the unwelcome visitor at the threshold and prevented the scourge gaining a footing among the great mass of community. And I think the majority of people agreed with that statement. So I'm coming to the end, so relax. When Europe's biggest outbreak of Asiatic cholera occurred in the major port city of Hamburg in northern Germany in 1892 and killed almost 10,000 people in about 6 weeks, Launcestonians were reassured that government at both levels was working in their best interests. In September 1892, that stalwart, who was now Chief Secretary and member for the Legislative Council for Launceston, A.D. Douglas, declared that every possible means will be adopted to prevent the introduction of cholera in Tasmania, and his government would cooperate with the other colonies to do so. The Central Board of Health was granted the power to disinfect all goods coming from all of Germany. There's a lot of trade between us and Germany. Okay, so cholera coming to an end. Cholera was not just a danger in the 19th century. A seventh pandemic began in 1961 in the form of the Vibrio eltor biotype, less virulent than Vibrio cholerae. Serious outbreaks of the Vibrio eltor occurred on Indonesia's Celebes Island, now called Sulawesi, in 1961, Peru in 1991, and Haiti since 2010. As far as I know, it's still going. But cholera remains an uncommon diagnosis in Australia, and in that sense, Australia remains a lucky country indeed. But, as there's always a but, isn't there? I have to end with a but. But as COVID-19 has shown, we can never be sure that cholera will not become more virulent and transmissible in a future climate-changing world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Now, any questions from anyone?
How does this affect the Aboriginals?
Haven't got anything specifically on that. It's not coming up in what I've read. It's a more generic discussion of these diseases. They don't specify. I don't think Alfred Moult did a lot on typhoid in Hobart, and he mapped all the houses where typhoid occurred for different years. They're unbelievable maps. You can actually have a look at those maps, because do you know that the Tasmanian Parliamentary Library has digitised all the Tasmanian parliamentary papers from 1856 to 1901, free to use on the website? Did you know that? No. Oh. That's why I was invited to tell you that. So you can actually go on and have a look at his map. They're unbelievable. And so he traced it, to sewer lines and, drainage outside. But there's never any mention of Aborigines. But I'd imagine that if they were exposed to any of these infectious diseases, like every other poor Tasmanian at the time, they wouldn't fare very well. Because it's really, even though it affects people in the prime of life, it always affects the poor more. Yes, Ken?